Welcome all to our first discussion this term with Juris North. We have the pleasure today of having Dr. Priti Ramani Nayyar from Guru Gobind Singh Indraprastha University in New Delhi, India. Thank you very much, Priti. Her paper is about changing paradigm in India's foreign direct investment policy, reflection of socio-economic jurisprudence in COVID era. Once again, Dr. Priti Ramani Nayyar, thank you very much for being with us. And if you want to start, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, George. A very warm good evening to all of you. And today, the topic of my presentation would be changing paradigm of India's foreign direct investment policy, reflection of socio-economic jurisprudence in COVID era. Now, the concept of foreign direct investment can be said to be an offshoot of globalization. And globalization, a term which is used to express inclination and alignment of international financial system, along with money, technological know-how, business ventures amongst nations across the globe, in addition to harmonization of the rules and regulations which govern the social, economic, and political and financial activities of persons and entities which are situated across the globe. In simple terms, foreign direct investment may be said to be an investment whereby an enterprise from one nation provides capital to an enterprise which is situated in another nation. The enterprise which engages in such global endeavors is known as multinational corporation popularly. The International Monetary Fund has also defined FDI, and the IMF defines FDI as an investment whose objective is to gain a long-term interest or a long-lasting interest by resident of one country in the in an entity which is a resident of another country. The long-term interest or the long-lasting interest generally infers continuation of a sustained and an extensive relationship between the investor and the investee, and wherein the degree of control by the investor over the investee is extensive and unconditional. FDI entails both the preliminary transaction, which created the relationship between the investor and the investee, and all the successive capital transactions or the capital transfers between the two entities. Now, FDI may be divided into greenfield versus brownfield FDI. Greenfield FDI basically means construction of new infrastructure like plant, machinery, offices, real estate by the foreign entity in the domestic entity. Basically, it means starting business from the scratch. Whereas brownfield FDI refers to merger of resources of the foreign entity and the domestic entity. So basically, whatever mergers and acquisitions popularly take place between between a foreign entity and a domestic entity may be said to be brownfield FDI. Now, FDI has been one of the most popular forms of foreign investment in the past 3 decades. Almost all the countries of the world, and especially the developing countries, are trying their best to attract more and more foreign direct investment, and there's a real clamor amongst all the developing nations to attract more and more foreign direct investment into their economies. Why? What is the reason? We may first look at the pros of foreign direct investment. No doubt, a foreign direct investment, it diversifies the investors' portfolios. There are other forms of investments like foreign portfolio investment, foreign institutional investment, and foreign direct investments adds another investment to the basket, to the kitty of the foreign investor, thereby diversifying his investment portfolio. No doubt, since the inflow of funds in a foreign direct investment transaction is so massive, of millions and trillions of dollars, it promotes a stable and a long-term lending solution. It is not possible that an enterprise invests millions of dollars in a domestic enterprise and withdraws it within 6 months. Obviously, it wants its returns, and hence it is said that a foreign direct investment is a more stable form of long-term lending. We may contrast this with foreign portfolio investment, wherein the lending by a foreign investor is short term, which basically means that they invest in stocks or shares of the domestic enterprise, and whenever they reap short term profit, they withdraw their investment. So, this is not the case with foreign direct investments. Foreign direct investments, no doubt, provides a massive funds, massive finances to the developing countries, and which developing country does not need capital to grow its economy, to grow its industry. So it provides massive inflow of funds to the domestic enterprises. Again, the foreign direct investment, when a foreign investor invests in a domestic enterprise, they also bring their managerial and technical skills and technical know-how, the best practices which they follow, which automatically get transmitted to the domestic enterprise, thereby elevating their technological know-how, providing them technological knowledge. Now, this form of investment has also been criticized, and some of the important reasons which are that these kind of investments, a lot of countries don't want investments or don't prefer investments in their, strategically important areas, like in security of the industries which are related to security or defense or telecommunication. So it is said that if they invite unabated foreign direct investment in such sensitive sectors of the economy, it will not be suitable for these industries, and it may compromise their national interest. Now, it is also said that foreign investors who bring in foreign investment, they have little or no attachment with the socio-economic concerns of the domestic entities, or their cultural practices, or their welfare. And it is almost most of the times it is evident that whatever foreign investors, whatever investment they are bringing with them, is mostly to earn a profit and to do business, rather than thinking about the socio-economic, or rather even the cultural constraints or the values of the domestic entities in which they invest. Also, it is seen many a times that foreign investors try to create complex mechanisms whereby they can find loopholes in the laws, or rather they can circumvent the foreign investment policies and gain unethical access to the local markets. So if the foreign direct investment has its pros, and at the same time it also has its cons. Now, the legal framework which governs the foreign direct investment in India is the legal setup. At the top of the legal setup is the Foreign Exchange Management Act, which is popularly known as the FEMA. And this is the principal legislation which consolidates the law with respect to foreign exchange. It facilitates external trade and also provides a mechanism to promote orderly development of foreign exchange market in India. The government, and there is a department of the government which is known as the Department for Promotion of Policy and Internal Trade, popularly known as the DPIIT. It's the department under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, Government of India. And this is the nodal agency which provides the framework for FDI. And in other words, it pronounces the FDI policy with respect to all the sectors of the economy from time to time. Now, this FDI policy is updated and revised regularly as per the policy or the commercial or the legal changes which are happening in the intervening period. So this nodal agency is responsible for promulgation of the FDI policy as well as any changes or any revisions which are required to be done in the FDI policy, keeping the socio-economic conditions or the financial conditions of that time. So what it does is whatever revisions it is ordering, they are done through an instrument called the press notes. So what happens is there is in a particular year, there may be press note 1 of 2020 specifying some condition or revision in the FDI policy, press note 2, press note 3, press note 4 of a particular FDI policy of a particular year. So the regulatory framework in brief of the FDI policy of the foreign direct investment in India consists of Foreign Exchange Management Act, the regulations made under Foreign Exchange Management Act, the notifications and the press notes and the circulars issued by the DPIIT. Now, there are two modes of entry. We may also call it two entry routes of foreign direct investment in India. The first route is known as the automatic route, and the second route is known as the government route. Now, in simple terms, automatic route means that the foreign investor does not require any permission from the government or the Central Bank of India to invest in any entity in India. What happens in this case is that after there is a share purchase agreement signed between a foreign investor and an Indian entity, the foreign investor is only required to complete some compliance requirements, like, for example, providing some documents which have been specified under the law to the Reserve Bank of India, which is the Central Bank of India, within 30 days of the date of execution of the share purchase agreement between the foreign investor and the domestic Indian entity. The second entry route of FDI in India is the government route. In this case, the foreign investor must obtain the prior approval of the government, which is generally given in about 30 days to 2 months, before it can embark upon signing any share purchase agreement or any exercise of any sort with the domestic Indian entity. So these are the two entry routes of foreign direct investment in India. And presently, most of the foreign direct investments which happen in India happen under the automatic route, since the Indian FDI policy was liberalized by the government from the year 1991. Now, Indian FDI regime is said to be one of the most liberal FDI regimes across the globe. The government is constantly trying to remove bottlenecks and simplify FDI procedures with an aim to get maximum FDI. But this was not the case since before. Before 1991, the Indian FDI regime was quite strict. But after 1991, when India promulgated economic reforms, and in 1995, when India joined the WTO and also signed the GATS, the FDI regime in India transformed from being extremely restrictive to being extremely open, which it is at this time, at the present time. As you can see from this table, in the pre-1991 era, foreign capital in India was allowed to promote rapid industrialization, but there was a very, very strict and a regimented control of the conditions of capital, foreign capital inflow. In fact, foreign capital was allowed selectively up to 40%, but the policy of the government was that the majority of the ownership and the effective control of the domestic industry should remain with the Indian hands. 1991, post 1991 was the liberalization phase wherein economic reforms were embarked by India, and about 35 priority sectors were listed, wherein the government said, okay, fine. So up to 51% of the equity under automatic route, we can allow the foreign investors. In 1997, which was again a liberalization phase, the policy was further liberalized, and there was 111 sectors which were allowed to have foreign direct investment and under the automatic route, which meant no approval required from the government. In 2000 to 2014 phase, which I call it a globalization phase, most of the sectors in the Indian economy were brought under, the automatic route, and except there was a little negative list which consisted of, foreign direct investment in gambling or, some illegal trade activities. Apart from that, all sectors, even the sectors like defense, insurance, telecom, retail, e-commerce, were put in the automatic route. Now, in 2014 till date, there has been a massive, a radical liberalization of the FDI policy, where more sectors have been opened to FDI, equity caps of existing sectors have been raised, and conditions have been further relaxed to garner more and more FDI. So what we can see from this table is that India has been systematically opening to global investors, and by opening new sectors of our economy and encouraging businesses through strategic relationships with different investment partners, strengthening our economic plans for the future. We can also say that India has been termed as one of the most attractive destinations globally for foreign direct investment. This is evident from statements of the OECD, which have said that India has been the topmost performer in removing FDI restrictions from 2011 to 2016. Also, in the UNCTAD's Global Investment Trend Monitor report, it was said that India was among the top recipients of FDI in 2019. And India has been consistently embarking upon reforms, which has commercial reforms, which has increased its rankings in the World Bank's ease of doing business from 77 to 63. Now, all these situations show that India has been one of the most attractive destinations of the FDI. Now, this is the data which was released by UNCTAD in about just very recently in the past 3-4 days, which says that India and China are the only countries, in the 2020 post the pandemic, where the FDI inflow has increased. And if you see all the other countries, this is the data of the UNCTAD, it's in minus, and India, the China is 4%, and India, the FDI growth is 13%. So with all this data, it is very evident that India has, it's all the time removing impediments, and all the time the government is in favor of garnering more and more FDI so for the economic growth of the country. This has been my purpose, to show all these slides which show that India has been successfully trying to liberalize its regime and remove impediments, if any, to the foreign direct investments. My purpose is to show that previously India was following, and India was in favor of garnering more and more FDI until COVID happened. COVID, a pandemic, spelled doom and disaster for the entire world. It led to lockdowns, which led to unprecedented economic deprivation for almost all the countries of the world, and India was no different. So, India, which was in favor of removing all restrictions, opening most of the sectors of the economy under the automatic route to the foreign investors, underwent a change in the foreign direct investment policy during the COVID pandemic as an aftermath of COVID pandemic. Now, in April 17th, 2020, that is after the lockdowns were pronounced in India because of the COVID pandemic, the government decided to change its FDI policy and change the way it was approaching the FDI policy in all these past years, in all the last 10, 20 years. There was a change, and the policy, the Press Note 3 of 2020 was promulgated, which basically prohibited any foreign direct investment flows from the countries which shared land borders with India, and they prohibited any foreign direct investment. Not prohibited, there was no blanket ban, but what it stated was that any foreign direct investment which comes from any country which shares land borders with India would have to be mandatorily approved by the government. So this was a paradigm shift in the Indian FDI jurisprudence, in the Indian thinking, that hitherto most of the sectors were getting an automatic approval with respect to the foreign direct investment. But now a time had come where, due to the COVID pandemic, there were a lot of distressed and battered corporate entities in India which needed protection from any opportunistic takeovers. And so India promulgated this policy wherein automatic route was discontinued, and countries sharing land borders with India were required to gain an approval, a mandatory government approval, before they could embark on any foreign direct investment venture in India. Not only that, the changed FDI policy in the COVID pandemic also stated that in case a beneficial owner of the investment also is situated or also stays or is a citizen of any such country which shares land borders with India, then also the government approval for such an FDI transaction would be mandatory. Now, as I've been saying, that this is at a significant variance from its earlier Indian FDI policies, wherein the government was just going gung-ho in removing the restrictions, encouraging more and more FDI. So this was a complete divergence as compared to the previous policy. Now, experts also say, it's also coming in newspapers, that it was a strategy to counter the Chinese acquisition of a lot of distressed and battered assets globally. But it was not stated in the FDI policy anywhere. It just said countries sharing land borders with India. There was also an objection by the Chinese government in the WTO with respect to these restrictions imposed by India in its foreign direct investment policy. And India countered it by saying that it can put any curbs in its foreign direct investment policy which is in its national security and which is in its national interest. Now, such a restrictive regime adopted by the Indian government was also criticized by some startups. A lot of startups in India, for example, Paytm, etc., have a lot of Chinese investors. So, a lot of startups which depend on the foreign direct investment for their survival or for their growth were not happy with the government, and stating that the government has restricted the flow of FDI into their companies. But the government responded by saying that they have not prohibited such foreign direct investments. It's just that such investments need more scrutiny from now on in wake of the COVID pandemic. So this attitude of the Indian government definitely reflects a change in the socio-economic jurisprudence in India. Now, what I believe is that a transaction such as a foreign direct investment, which brings massive inflow of funds in a country, should be subjected through more checks and balances. In fact, I used to get surprised earlier when I used to read that there was such massive liberalization exercise which was going on in the corridors of the government pre-COVID, that's before the COVID, where they were going on opening sectors, going on bringing sectors under the automatic route, going on removing the so-called impediments, or which I think were regulations or checks to to check such massive inflow of money coming in the country. So what I believe is that uh, uh, these kind of checks in the COVID era are necessary. Firstly, because FDI, according to me, is not only a mere exchange of money or a mere exchange of goods or services, but it's also a profound form of human relationship across borders of the nation. I mean, it's not disputed that MNCs do bring a lot of wealth, a lot of managerial skills, best practices, technological know-how, corporate values to the host nation, in addition to bringing a lot of social and political influence of the host country. However, such massive inflow of funds should definitely be subject to more checks and balances by the government of the domestic enterprise, COVID or no COVID withstanding. Also, I believe that whenever such exercise and a foreign direct investment, whenever such transaction is taking place, before such transaction takes place, I mean, I've never read, whatever little research I've done, I've never read governments undertaking impact assessment exercises wherein they undertake a study whether foreign direct investment brought in by this entity, in specific cases, not generally, that FDI brings in money, FDI brings in capital, FDI leads to economic growth. These are some generalizations. There has to be an impact assessment study by the government in each case wherein a massive inflow of funds is coming, and only after that exercise, what kind of impact will this FDI transaction bring on the country, only then such an FDI transaction should be approved. Now, not only by the government, it should be also be a mandate for the MNCs to undertake a project study, which should be submitted by such investor or the MNC which is embarking on the foreign direct investment and enterprise. That what are your aims and objectives? Clearly specify your aims and objectives for conducting such a transaction, and what are the number of infrastructural facilities you propose to develop. What are the corporate social responsibility exercises you propose to undertake in the country in which you are investing a massive inflow of funds? So it is true that profits may be your motive, but what kind of an impact this exercise will have on the host economy also needs to be studied by the MNC before embarking on such an exercise. Now, this brings us to a very, very important concept, is the role of ethics in FDI. Whatever books most of the books which I've read about foreign direct investment, I've seldom come across ethics in FDI policy. Now the time has come that the element of corporate the corporations realize that they are not merely big business houses, but they are also corporate citizens. Now, this concept of corporate citizens is a concept which acknowledges the fact that foreign entities do have societal and ethical responsibilities, which is beyond their aim to mint money and to mint profits. And it's very important that the company laws, the merger and acquisition laws of not only India, but across all the countries should incorporate that the foreign investor, by embarking upon such a merger or acquisition, what are its aims, what are its objectives, and what are its what are the implications of this commercial transactions which would happen on the domestic enterprise. So it is very, very important that any strategic alliance for a foreign investor has to be also compliant with a fair competition policy of the domestic enterprise. So now what we see is that these corporations, these MNCs, should also have a socio-economic as well as ethical responsibility, which commences from the foreign entity till the domestic entity. Now, COVID is not only a time, not only for India, but also for all the other countries of the world to respect and incorporate, and more importantly, introspect their foreign direct investment policies and align them with their constitutional values, with their socio-economic values. Now, COVID has also created a situation wherein there may be more and more clamor to bring in foreign direct investments, because a lot of economies have taken an economic beating. There is a lot of distressed economies out there. So COVID is also a time to balance these foreign direct investment policies, at the same time introspect your nation's foreign direct investment policy and bring it in alignment with your constitutional values, your social and economic values. Also, it is very important that there is a balance between these two, so that there is an inflow of funds emanating from a foreign direct investment exercise, but it is also in alignment with the socio-economic jurisprudence of a particular country, so that it results in an all-inclusive and an overall development, and the development in true sense of the domestic economy and the host economy. Thank you so much. I end my presentation.
Thank you very much, Priti Ramani from India, and I'm going to stop recording now. We'll start the questions and answers.